Her family had already decided who deserved to be chosen. It wasn't Emma. While her sister shone, she spent her life quietly making everyone else's dreams come true. Invisible, forgotten, always in the background. But the day the Alpha King arrived, he ignored everything her family had planned and walked straight toward the one person no one expected him to notice. Sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the very one destiny has been waiting for all along. If you love stirring romances featuring Alpha Kings, filled with rejection, redemption, and unforgettable love, subscribe and follow along. Emma's story is just beginning. Emma had spent her entire life watching her family choose her sister first. By the time she turned 23, she had stopped wondering when it would finally be her turn. She was the second kind of daughter, not because she lacked grace or warmth or the quiet beauty that doesn't announce itself but settles into a room like late afternoon sunlight, but because her family had decided, somewhere in the wordless arithmetic of favoritism, that Lyra was the one worth noticing. And Emma, well, Emma was just there. A background figure in a portrait painted for someone else. She'd grown so used to the arrangement that some mornings she woke up already tired, already bracing for the invisible weight of being overlooked before the day even had a chance to begin. That particular morning was no different, or so she thought. She was wrong. The news arrived like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every noble house in the packed territory before the sun had fully risen. Alpha King Kale was coming. No one knew exactly how the Alpha King chose his future queen, but everyone knew one thing. Once he made his choice, it could never be undone. He was traveling through the northern regions, looking for someone, a chosen companion, drawn not from politics alone, but from the daughters of families with honor and standing. The kind of family Emma belonged to technically. A detail her family seemed to have quietly forgotten by breakfast. The word chosen floated through the halls of their estate, like smoke, beautiful and suffocating at the same time, and Emma breathed it in along with everyone else, not yet knowing it would one day settle inside her chest and change everything. Her mother was already at the writing desk before Emma came downstairs, her letters sealed with wax, her handwriting precise and purposeful. Her father stood by the window with the particular stillness of a man rehearsing what he planned to say out loud. And Lyra, golden, effortless Lyra, sat at the center of it all, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips as though she'd already been told the ending and found it satisfying. Nobody looked up when Emma walked in. Nobody made room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, that familiar hollow ache pressing gently against her ribs, and then she crossed quietly to the kettle and put it on, because someone had to. That was the shape of Emma's life, present, useful and invisible in the same breath. A rejected daughter who had never once been told she was rejected, because no one had thought to explain it to her. It had simply become the air she moved through. "We'll need your help with the preparations," her mother said, still writing, not looking up, not a question. A directive, soft enough to sound polite and firm enough to leave no room for anything else. Emma said of course. She always said of course. The words came out of her so naturally by now that they barely required thought. They were simply the reflex of a girl who had spent years making herself easy to overlook and even easier to need. And she did need to be needed. That was the honest, painful truth of it. She had built her sense of belonging out of small acts of service, out of being the one who remembered things, who fixed things, who stayed when others left. She had confused usefulness with worth for so long that she wasn't entirely sure she knew the difference anymore. But somewhere beneath that quiet compliance, something stirred, not loudly, not dramatically, just a faint and stubborn pulse of something that hadn't quite given up yet. The preparations began within hours. Fabric swatches were spread across the dining table. Seamstresses arrived at the side entrance. Notes were exchanged with neighboring families, careful, and coded with the particular social language of people who understood that appearances were a form of currency. And Emma moved through all of it like a quiet current beneath a busy river, fetching things, holding things, adjusting things, her hands always occupied, her name never at the center of any conversation. At one point, her father walked past her carrying a bolt of pale silver cloth and said, almost absently, "That color would suit Lyra well." And Emma nodded and thought, yes, it probably would. She didn't let herself think about whether it would suit her. That kind of thinking was a luxury she'd stopped allowing herself somewhere around the age of 12, when she'd first understood, without anyone saying it directly, that she was not the daughter this family had built their hopes around. That evening, alone in the room that had always been slightly smaller than Lyra's, Emma sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her palms flat against the quilt and breathed. The house around her buzzed with anticipation, real, electric, almost trembling with it. Somewhere down the hall, Lyra was being measured and praised and prepared for a destiny the whole family had quietly agreed belonged to her. And Emma was already composing the list of things she'd need to do tomorrow. More alterations, more arrangements, more smiling in rooms where no one looked at her face long enough to notice whether the smile reached her eyes. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't entirely name, the goodness of it felt less like a virtue and more like a sentence. Somewhere far to the north, Alpha King Kyle was already riding toward the estate. Everyone believed he was coming for Lyra. Not a single person, not even Emma, imagined he would stop in front of the one woman no one had ever chosen. The morning of the preparations arrived with the kind of quiet urgency that fills a house before something important, the sort of stillness that isn't really stillness at all, but anticipation wearing a mask. Emma was up before anyone else, not because anyone had asked her to be, but because that was simply who she was. The one who made sure the fire was lit before the cold reached the hallways, the one who checked that the breakfast things were set before her mother came downstairs with her lists and her perfectly organized expectations. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her hands already knowing what to do before her mind fully caught up with the day. Outside, frost still clung to the window panes. Inside, the house was already humming with the particular energy of a family preparing to present its very best, and Emma, as always, was the one making sure that best was ready to be seen. Lyra appeared mid-morning, wrapped in a dressing gown, her dark hair loose and catching the light in a way that made even tiredness look like elegance. She stood in the center of the main room, while the seamstress made final adjustments to the gown, a deep ivory silk that had taken Emma 3 evenings to alter correctly, her fingers sore from the needle, her eyes strained from working by candlelight. Nobody mentioned that. Lyra tilted her chin upward so their mother could fasten a delicate chain at her throat, and their mother said, "Perfect. Absolutely perfect," with the kind of warmth in her voice that Emma had spent years learning not to measure herself against. Then Lyra glanced down at her sleeves and said, without looking up, "Make sure these are perfect before tonight. Not unkindly, not cruelly. Simply the way someone speaks when they have never once had to think about the effort behind the thing they're asking for." Emma said, "Of course." She always said, "Of course." The afternoon deepened, and so did the industry of preparation. Servants whispered stories about Alpha King Kale as they worked, passing rumors between themselves like small flames being kept alive. Some said he never looked twice at beauty alone. Others claimed he could read a person's character before they spoke a single word, that he watched, that he waited, that he saw things most people spent their whole lives hiding. Emma listened without comment, her hands occupied with the winter flower arrangement she was assembling for the entrance hall. Fairy tales had never belonged to people like her, but something about that last detail, that he watched, that he truly saw, settled somewhere quiet inside her chest, and didn't entirely leave. She was still arranging the flowers when one of the younger servants rounded the corner too quickly and caught the edge of the side table. A ceramic vase tilted, tipped, and shattered across the stone floor, water spreading fast between the broken pieces. The girl froze, her face white with the particular panic of someone who expects to be reprimanded. Emma was already crouching beside her before the last fragment stopped skidding, gathering the larger pieces with careful hands, saying quietly, "It's all right, get a cloth. I'll have this cleared before anyone comes through." The girl stared at her for half a second, then nodded and disappeared. Emma cleaned it up alone, quickly and without fuss, and then returned to her flowers as though nothing had happened. Nobody saw. Nobody came around that corner, but the moment existed, small and complete, and entirely like her, the kind of thing Emma did constantly, instinctively, in the spaces between everything else. By evening, everything was ready. The gown hung perfectly. The hair was arranged with artful precision. The estate smelled of warmed candles and winter herbs, and every room that mattered had been quietly, invisibly made beautiful by the one person nobody would think to credit. Emma stood in the doorway of Lyra's room for a moment, watching her sister take one last look in the mirror, and something moved through her chest. Not quite envy, not quite sadness, but something in between that had no clean name. She had spent so many years helping other people become ready for their moments that she had almost forgotten to wonder what her own moment might feel like. Almost. Because underneath all the quiet acceptance, underneath the practiced smiles and the efficient hands and the careful way she made herself small enough not to crowd anyone else's space, something in Emma had never fully stopped wondering. She slipped away before anyone noticed she was gone, which of course no one did. She found a quiet corner of the upper hallway and sat on the narrow bench beneath the frost-edged window, and for one unguarded moment she let herself feel the full weight of it. The belonging she had never quite managed to earn inside her own home, the self-worth that had been slowly, quietly worn down by years of being second, by years of after you, and maybe next time, and we need your help. Tomorrow, everyone in the kingdom would be watching Alpha King Kyle choose a future queen. Emma believed she already knew who he would choose. She was about to discover how wrong an entire family could be. The great hall had been transformed into something that felt less like a reception and more like a performance. Candles banked in long rows along the stone walls, tables dressed in deep burgundy cloth, the kind of deliberate grandeur that announces itself before anyone walks through the door. Every noble family in the territory had arrived, their daughters dressed in their finest, their postures carefully arranged into the particular shape of people, trying very hard to appear as though they weren't trying at all. The air was warm and close and electric with wanting, and at the far end of the hall, Alpha King Kale stood with the stillness of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by rooms designed to impress him, broad-shouldered, unhurried, his dark eyes moving slowly across the space with the quiet precision of a man who was always paying attention. He had not spoken much since arriving. He didn't need to. His presence did something to the air around him that no amount of candlelight or ceremony could replicate. Emma was not supposed to be visible. That had been made clear, not in words exactly, but in the comfortable way her family had arranged the evening, Lyra positioned near the front, near the warmth, near the light, while Emma occupied the quieter geography of the room's edges. She didn't mind. The edges suited her. From there, she could see everything, move freely, and do what she had always done best. Notice what needed doing and do it without being asked. She was carrying a small tray of water glasses toward the side table when she saw the elderly woman near the east pillar press one hand against the stone wall, her face going pale in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. Emma changed direction without hesitation, reaching the woman's side before anyone else had registered that something was wrong. "Here," she said softly, guiding her to a chair, pressing a glass gently into her hands. "Take your time. I've got you." Across the hall, Kyle was being approached by a succession of daughters, each one graceful, each one practiced, each one offering him her very best version of herself. He received them with courtesy and said the appropriate things and let his gaze drift, the way it always drifted in rooms like this, looking for the thing that wasn't performing. His eyes moved past the candlelight and the silk and the careful smiles, and landed briefly on the far side of the room. A young woman in a simple dress was crouching beside an elderly guest, one hand resting lightly on the woman's arm, speaking too quietly to hear across the distance. There was nothing dramatic about it. No audience, no acknowledgement, no pause to see if anyone was watching. She simply helped, completely, and without theatre, and then rose and moved on. Cale watched for a moment longer than he intended to. Then someone spoke to him and he answered, but some part of his attention stayed on the edges of the room. It was the child that made him stop entirely. A frightened little child had become separated from whoever she belonged to and was standing near the servants' corridor with the particular frozen quality of a young one trying very hard not to cry in public. Most of the guests moved past her without registering her presence. The evening had its own momentum, and a lost child was a small thing against the scale of it. But Emma saw her from halfway across the room, and she crossed to the girl without breaking stride, kneeling down to her level with an ease that suggested this was not the first time she'd done something like this. She said something that made the child's expression shift from barely held panic to something softer. Then Emma took her hand and walked her gently through the crowd, scanning faces until she found the frantic young servant who had clearly been searching for the last 10 minutes. The reunion was quiet and immediate and entirely unremarked upon. Emma smiled, gave the child's hand one last small squeeze, and turned back to the room. Cale had not looked away once. Meanwhile, Lyra was radiant. She laughed at the right moments, tilted her head at the precise angle that candlelight favored, and held the room's attention the way a flame holds a moth's, effortlessly, magnetically, by simply being what she was. The nobles around her leaned in. Her mother watched from a short distance with barely concealed satisfaction. By every reasonable measure, the evening was going exactly as planned. Cale would see Lyra. Cale would be impressed. The choice, as far as Emma's family was concerned, was already made. It had been made before anyone walked through the door, decided in the quiet confidence of people who had never seriously entertained another possibility. Not one of them glanced toward the edges of the room. Not one of them thought to wonder what the Alpha King's eyes had been following for the past hour. Emma was restacking a toppled arrangement of small candles near the back corridor. One had tilted, and the wax was beginning to run when she felt it. Not a sound exactly, more a shift in the quality of the air nearby, the particular stillness that precedes a presence rather than follows it. She straightened and turned, and found Alpha King Cale standing closer than she'd expected, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not cold, not warm, simply very, very attentive. She felt the full weight of his gaze in a way that had nothing to do with rank or ceremony and everything to do with the unsettling sensation of being genuinely seen. Her first instinct was to step aside, to make herself smaller, to assume he needed to pass. "I'm sorry," she said automatically, moving to clear his path. But Cale didn't move. He simply looked at her for a moment and then said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "Don't apologize. You're the only person in this room who hasn't wasted a single moment trying to impress me." For the rest of the evening, Emma tried to convince herself it had meant nothing. A polite remark. A passing observation. She had no idea that, from that moment on, Alpha King Cale would remember only one face when he thought about that night. And it wasn't Lyra's. The morning of the selection arrived with a silence that felt almost sacred, the kind that settles over a place when everyone inside it is holding their breath at exactly the same time. The estate had been arranged with ceremonial precision. Chairs set in careful rows, the family positioned at the front with the quiet confidence of people who had already decided how this story ended. Lyra stood at the center of it all, composed and luminous in the ivory gown, her hands folded in front of her with practiced grace. Emma stood slightly to the left and 2 steps back, which was, she had come to understand, the spatial grammar of her entire life. She told herself she was fine with it. She almost believed it. The room filled slowly with the weight of expectation, and somewhere beneath that weight, so familiar she barely noticed it anymore, was the dull and constant ache of already knowing she would not be the one anyone looked at when the moment came. Gale entered without announcement, no trumpet, no formal procession, just the man himself walking into the room with the unhurried authority of someone who had never needed ceremony to command attention. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Postures straightened without anyone deciding to straighten them. Even the candlelight seemed to pause. He wore no crown, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made the absence of one irrelevant, a gravity that belonged to him entirely, independent of title or display. His dark eyes moved across the room in that way Emma had noticed the night before, methodical, unhurried, reading something beneath the surface of everything he looked at. He greeted the assembled families with a few words, quiet and direct, and then the room fell into the particular stillness of a held breath that has nowhere left to go. The selection began. Kael moved through the room slowly, pausing before each family with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that the weight of this moment was different for everyone present. He spoke briefly with the daughters who had been presented, asked questions Emma couldn't hear from where she stood, listened in a way that suggested he was actually processing the answers rather than simply waiting for them to end. One by one, the families near the front exchanged glances of restrained hope. Emma's mother had arranged herself at an angle that kept Lyra perfectly visible, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone performing calm while feeling anything but. Lyra herself was flawless, warm, poised, everything a family could hope to offer. Emma watched from her 2 steps back and thought, he'll choose her. Of course he will. And she pressed that thought down flat, the way she pressed every other thought that threatened to feel like wanting. Then something shifted. Kael had been moving in a slow and deliberate line through the room, and now he paused, not in front of Lyra, not in front of any of the other daughters who had been so carefully positioned, but in a way that changed the geometry of the entire space. He turned, slightly. Enough. His gaze crossed the room and found Emma with a directness that made her breath catch before she'd even fully registered what was happening. She assumed he was looking past her. She stepped slightly to the side, the automatic reflex of a woman who had spent her life moving out of the way. But his eyes followed the movement. And then he began walking, not toward the front of the room, not toward the careful arrangement her family had constructed, but toward her. The murmur that moved through the assembled guests was barely audible and completely unmistakable. Emma's heart was doing something she had no good word for. He was still coming toward her, and she still could not make it make sense, her mind running rapid calculations, searching for the explanation that didn't involve what it increasingly appeared to involve. Perhaps he had a question. Perhaps she was standing in front of something he needed. Perhaps this was some procedural thing she didn't understand, some formality of the selection process that required him to acknowledge everyone in the room. She held very still and kept her expression polite and neutral, the way she had learned to hold herself in moments when she didn't know what was expected of her, which had been most of her life. Beside her, she felt rather than saw her mother go rigid. Across the room, Lyra's composure flickered, just once, just briefly, like a candle in a draught. Kael stopped in front of her, close enough that Emma had to tilt her chin up slightly to meet his gaze, and when she did, she found him looking at her with that same quality of attention she had felt the night before, complete, unhurried, as though the rest of the room had simply ceased to matter. Then he reached out his hand, steady, certain, without a trace of hesitation, and said, in a voice that carried through the silence like a stone dropped into still water, "I have made my choice." No one moved. Emma's mother looked instinctively toward Lyra, waiting for her daughter to step forward. Lyra herself drew a slow breath, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly against the folds of her ivory gown. They all believed the next movement belonged to her. It didn't. Kyle never looked away from Emma. Not once. Not for a single second. And in the breathless, bewildered silence of that room, full of noble families and careful plans, and a future everyone had already decided, Emma stood completely still, looking at an outstretched hand that was, impossibly, unmistakably, meant for her. Emma's first instinct was not joy. It wasn't even surprise. Exactly. It was something closer to the particular panic of a person who has been handed something precious and cannot stop thinking about the moment it gets taken back. She looked at Kyle's outstretched hand, and then, before she could stop herself, she took a small step backward, not away from him, or not entirely, but in the instinctive way of someone who has learned, through years of quiet repetition, that good things arriving in her direction usually belong to someone else. "I think," she said carefully, her voice lower than she intended, "that there may have been a mistake." The words came out steady, which surprised her, because nothing inside her felt steady at all. Kyle didn't lower his hand. He didn't look confused or embarrassed or any of the things a man might look when told he had erred. He simply waited, with that unnerving patience of his, as though he had anticipated exactly this response and had already decided what to do with it. "My sister," Emma continued, because someone had to say it, and apparently it was going to be her, "is the one your visit was arranged around. She paused, searching for the right word, the honest word. She's everything a family presents when they want to make a good impression. I'm just the one who helped her get ready." She said it without bitterness. That was the most devastating part. There was no edge in her voice, no performance of self-deprecation designed to be contradicted. She meant it. She had simply told him the truth of how she understood herself, plainly and without drama, the way you state a fact about the weather. Something moved behind Kyle's eyes when she said it, not pity, nothing as simple as that, but a kind of recognition, sharp and quiet, as though she had just confirmed something he had already suspected and wished he hadn't. He let a beat of silence pass. Then he said, "I know who your sister is. I also know who you are. Those are not the same conversation." He said it gently. But there was a weight to it that Emma felt somewhere beneath her sternum, in the place where she kept the things she didn't let herself examine too closely. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, because she genuinely didn't know how to argue with that. And arguing was what she had come prepared to do. Around them, the room was still holding its collective breath, the assembled families frozen in the particular tableau of people witnessing something they hadn't been given a script for. Emma was aware of her mother somewhere behind her, aware of Lyra, aware of the weight of every set of eyes in that hall. But Kyle was looking at her as though none of that existed, as though the only relevant geography in the room was the space between the two of them. And she found, to her considerable alarm, that his certainty was more disorienting than any argument could have been. She took his hand. Not with confidence. She wasn't capable of confidence in that moment, but with the careful, uncertain movement of someone stepping onto ice they aren't sure will hold. His grip was steady and warm and immediate, and he didn't make anything of it, didn't mark the moment with ceremony or expression, simply closed his hand around hers as though it were the most natural conclusion to a sentence that had been a long time coming. He led her forward, back through the frozen tableau of the hall, and Emma kept her eyes ahead because she could not bring herself to look at her family's faces. Not yet. She could feel them, though, the shock radiating off her mother like heat off stone, the particular silence coming from Lyra's direction that was its own kind of language. Emma had spent her whole life learning to read the emotional weather of that family. She read it now without looking, and she held Kyle's hand a little tighter without meaning to. In the days that followed, he was not what she had expected. She wasn't entirely sure what she had expected, distance perhaps, or the formal courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation. Instead, Kyle was present in a way that was almost unsettling in its quietness. He didn't make grand gestures. He didn't deliver speeches about her worth or her character or the reasons for his choice. He simply appeared at the edge of a room she was working in, falling into step beside her during a walk she hadn't known he was aware of, asking her questions about small things, and then actually listening to the answers with that complete, undivided attention of his that she still hadn't found a way to get used to. Once, she caught herself explaining the way she organized the flower arrangements and why, and then stopped abruptly, embarrassed by the mundanity of it. Kyle said, "Go on," and meant it. That was somehow the most destabilizing thing he had done yet. The moment that undid her most came quietly, the way the most important moments always do. They were walking along the upper corridor after a long formal dinner, the kind of evening that required Emma to be gracious and composed for hours at a time, and she was tired in the deep way that has nothing to do with sleep. She had said something, she couldn't remember what exactly, something self-deprecating, some small habitual diminishment of herself slipping out before she caught it, and Kyle stopped walking. Just stopped, right there in the corridor, and turned to look at her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her before and didn't have a name for yet. "You do that often," he said quietly. "Make yourself smaller. Say things about yourself that you would never say about anyone else." Emma looked at him. "It's just honesty," she said. Kyle shook his head, very slightly. "No," he said. "It's a habit. And it's not the same thing." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, and Emma stared straight ahead and felt something she had carried for so long she'd stopped noticing its weight begin, very slowly, to shift. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, written in her mother's precise handwriting, the kind of script that had always made even warmth look like an instruction. Emma recognized the seal before she opened it, the small burgundy stamp of her family's house, pressed with the same careful deliberateness her mother applied to everything she wanted to be taken seriously. She sat with it unopened for a long moment, turning it over once in her hands, and was quietly surprised to discover that her pulse remained entirely steady. 3 months ago, a letter from home would have activated something anxious and hopeful in her simultaneously, that old, exhausting combination of dreading disappointment and wanting, despite everything, to be welcomed. Now she simply opened it, read it with clear eyes, and set it down on the table without urgency. Her mother wanted to visit. Her mother was proud of her. Her mother used the word always in a sentence about belief and support that Emma could not, in good conscience, reconcile with a single specific memory. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the window and stood there for a while, watching the frost on the glass catch the morning light. And she let herself think about it honestly, the way she was slowly learning to think about things, without the reflexive softening she used to apply to any thought that felt too direct. Her family had not been cruel. That was the complicated part, the part that had taken her the longest to understand. Because cruelty would have been simpler. Cruelty has edges you can point to. What her family had done was quieter and harder to name. They had simply organized their love in a particular direction and left Emma to find her own warmth in whatever remained. She had found it in usefulness, in service, in making herself indispensable to people who never thought to wonder what she needed in return. She had called it belonging for years. Standing at that window, she finally admitted to herself that it hadn't been. Not really. She was still at the window when she heard the door. Not Kyle, She knew his particular quality of silence too well by now to confuse it with anyone else. This was different, lighter, more hesitant. She turned and found Lyra standing in the doorway with an expression Emma had never seen on her sister's face before, not the composed, candlelit version of Lyra that the family had spent years polishing, but something underneath that, something unguarded and slightly lost. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The distance between them held everything that had never been said, all the years of arrangements and ivory gowns, and 2 steps back. And for once neither of them rushed to paper over it with politeness. Then Lyra said, quietly, "I spent my whole life believing I had to be perfect because everyone expected me to be." She paused. "I never stopped to think about what that cost you." Emma looked at her sister, really looked, the way you look at someone when you finally stop seeing the role they played and start seeing the person inside it. "It cost us both things," Emma said. "Just different things. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't the erasure of everything that had passed between them. But it was real, and it was theirs. And when Lyra left an hour later, there was something lighter in the space she left behind. 2 women who had grown up inside the same broken system and had finally, quietly, recognized each other across it." She wrote back to her mother that afternoon, a short letter, honest and without cruelty, that said she wished the family well, and that she was building something new, and that she hoped, in time, they could find their way to a relationship that was real rather than convenient. She didn't apologize for anything. She read it over once, changed nothing, and sealed it herself. It was, she realized as she pressed the wax, the first letter she had ever written home that didn't contain a single sentence designed to make someone else comfortable at her own expense. The feeling that followed wasn't triumph, it was quieter than that, more like putting down something heavy after carrying it so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it at all. She set the letter aside and sat for a moment in the unfamiliar lightness of it, and thought, "Oh, so this is what it feels like to take up the space you were always allowed to take." It was Cale who led her back to the great hall that evening, empty now in a way that made it feel entirely different from the night that had changed everything. No candles, no burgundy cloth, no careful rows of chairs arranged for an audience. Just the stone walls and the winter dark pressing gently against the high windows, and the 2 of them standing in the middle of it, their footsteps quiet against the floor. Cale stopped near the center of the room and looked around slowly, and then said, without preamble, "This is where everyone expected me to choose your sister." His voice was low, unhurried, the way it always was when he was saying something he had thought about carefully. Emma stood beside him and looked at the empty space where it had all happened, the held breath, the outstretched hand, the silence that had rewritten everything. "This is where I first saw the woman I wanted beside me," Cale continued. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was the one she had come to know best, that complete, undefended attention that still, even now, made her want to step sideways out of its path. "I chose you that day," he said, "but today I'm asking something different. A pause, clean and deliberate. Will you choose this life with me, Emma?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked past every carefully presented option in that hall and stopped in front of her, who had seen her before she had any idea she was visible, who had never once asked her to be more than she was, or less than she was, or different from she was in any direction. And she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time, some door she had stopped believing anyone would ever think to knock on. Then she smiled, not the practiced smile, not the one she had worn in rooms that looked through her, but a real one, unhurried and unguarded, rising from somewhere deep. "Yes," she said, simply and completely, the way the truest answers always arrive. Outside, winter still covered the mountains, but for the first time in Emma's life, it no longer felt cold, because the place she had spent years searching for had never been a kingdom. It had been the quiet certainty that she was finally home. Emma spent years believing she was born to stand in someone else's shadow. She measured her worth by how useful she could be, convinced that love belonged to those who were chosen first. But everything changed the day one man looked past appearances and saw what everyone else had overlooked. Cale didn't rescue her from who she was. He simply refused to let the world define her value. Little by little, his unwavering certainty gave Emma the courage to see herself through different eyes. And in the end, the greatest victory wasn't that an alpha king chose her. It was that she finally believed she was worthy of being chosen. Maybe that's why this story feels so real, because many people know what it's like to feel invisible, to watch others receive the love, attention, or recognition they secretly hoped for. Emma reminds us that our worth has never depended on someone else's approval. Sometimes the right person doesn't change your life by giving you value. They simply help you discover the value that was already there. If Emma's journey touched your heart, tell us in the comments. Have you ever felt like the second choice? We'd love to read your story. And if you enjoy emotional Alpha King romances filled with redemption, destiny, and unforgettable love, subscribe and turn on notifications. More stories are waiting for you, and under the same moon, someone else's impossible story may become your favorite one yet.